It was a Sunday morning, distinguished not by weather, which was of the usual damp indecision common to the county, but by the presence of an unexpected nun. The chapel of St. Frideswyde, tucked between the High Street haberdashery and a solicitor's office whose window displayed only dust and Latin maxims, was not accustomed to novelties. Its congregation was a faithful half-dozen, reduced over the years by removals, deaths, and what the vicar referred to, when mildly tipsy, as the new religion of Sunday lie-ins. Yet on this particular morning, a figure in full black habit and white wimple took a seat in the second pew from the front. She knelt, crossed herself with an unhurried solemnity, and then folded her hands in an attitude of immovable devotion. She did not look left or right. She did not fidget. She did not so much as blink with human regularity. Mrs. Gedge, who ran the milliner's shop and considered herself custodian of the parish's moral fabric, found herself craning to see the newcomer more thoroughly. The angle was unsatisfactory. She leaned forward, whispering, "Is that one of those missionary sisters, I wonder?" To her neighbour, Mr. Carby, who was deaf in one ear and made up for it by broadcasting everything. He heard in tones suitable for a railway platform. "A nun?" he boomed, causing the vicar's faltering sermon on humility to acquire an unintended pause. "Well, we don't get many of those about here, not since Father Burbage retired, eh?" The ripple of titters from the back pews was rapidly stifled, but a certain liveliness had crept into the otherwise soporific service. Afterwards, in the damp little churchyard, the congregation made its customary slow drift towards the gate, but this time with more backward glances than forward steps. The nun had not joined them. She remained in the pew, still as an effigy, ignoring even the clatter of hymn books and the faint whiff of Mrs. Gedge's lavender water. "She's praying," said Mrs. Gedge, in the tone of one making a charitable allowance. "But praying to what, I should very much like to know. That habit looked awfully theatrical to me. Perhaps she's with the new people at the chapel house. They've been taking in lodgers, artists, I hear, bohemians. Likely she's an actress. Practicing." Mr. Carby was doubtful. "If she's acting, she's a good one. Didn't budge a muscle all through." Meanwhile, the vicar, a kindly man of nerves and waistcoat buttons, approached the silent figure after ensuring his parishioners had dispersed beyond gossiping range. He cleared his throat gently and suggested in the lowest of clerical undertones that the service had concluded. The nun did not reply. She rose, slowly, with a deliberate grace, and walked past him without the slightest glance of acknowledgement. Her footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor, and she went out into the street without breaking stride. It was there, however, that the stillness ended. For, having taken not 10 paces along the cobbled lane, the nun abruptly stopped, turned sharply as though startled by some unseen presence, and dropped the prayer book she had been carrying. By the time the vicar reached the doorway, she was gone. Only the prayer book remained, lying open on the wet stones, its pages fluttering in the breeze, and in the margin, beside a psalm, was a penciled note in a cramped, anxious hand. "They are watching me. If anything should happen, tell Inspector Pubright." By Monday morning, the appearance of the silent nun had become common knowledge in Flaxborough, though not, it seemed, through the vicar's own doing. He had confided the matter only to his wife, who had in turn told Mrs. Cribble, the grocer's wife, in the strictest confidence. Mrs. Cribble, with a loyalty both selective and talkative, had mentioned it only to her sister at the post office, who repeated it discreetly while selling stamps. By the time the first omnibus rumbled through the market square, the story had acquired all the permanence and embroidery of local truth. At the counter of the railway buffet, two elderly men in brown overcoats gave their versions with alternating authority. One maintained the woman was a refugee nun, hidden from sinister agents of foreign powers. The other was equally sure she was the estranged wife of a bookmaker from Ipswich, taking ecclesiastical disguise to evade creditors. At the same time, in the snug bar of the Mason's Arms, Mrs. Gedge, already treated as the most reliable witness, expanded her account with little reluctance. According to her, the woman had neither sung the hymns nor turned the pages of her prayer book, which was as good as a confession of guilt in my view. This was met with grave nods by those who agreed that to remain mute during onward Christian soldiers was tantamount to sedition. Others were less solemn. Mr. Brigg, who ran the tobacconists, asserted that any woman so thoroughly veiled must be concealing a squint, a moustache, or worse. He saw the whole affair as theatricality being the last refuge of a dishonest female. His remark was greeted with laughter that carried across the bar to Mrs. Gedge's disapproval. In the midst of such varying certainties, Inspector Pubright listened with the polite detachment of a man hearing his neighbours describe the weather in 6 incompatible ways. He had received the prayer book that very morning, delivered by the vicar in a state of mortified apology, and was examining its penciled message with mild curiosity. "It isn't one of our parishioners, Inspector," the vicar explained, wringing his hands over his hat brim. "I pride myself on knowing every face, even those that visit only for funerals. This lady, or whoever she was, had never been seen before. Quite unnerving, you know." "And then this note," Pubright reassured him with the unhurried gravity that the inspector could apply as easily as his spectacles. He promised the matter would be looked into, and saw the vicar out of the station with a gentle word about damp paving stones being treacherous this time of year. When the door closed, Pubright regarded the book again. It was a well-worn copy of the Psalms, published by a minor London press 40 years earlier, its pages faintly scented with lavender and dust. The handwriting in the margin was indeed cramped, but unmistakably urgent. It gave no name, no date, only the assertion that they were watching. Sergeant Love, who had been following the gossip circuit more enthusiastically than his superior, ventured the theory that the message was the sort of melodrama one might scribble to alarm a clergyman. "If you ask me, sir," he said, "she was no nun, just somebody dressed up to cause a stir. You've only to look at the way people have taken to it. Half the town's talking of nothing else. It's all grist to the public house mill." Pubright inclined his head, neither endorsing nor rejecting the sergeant's conclusion. He had learned long ago that when Flaxborough seized upon a mystery, the truth, like a child in a crowded playground, could easily be trampled under the stomping of conjecture. Still, a detail nagged quietly at him. The nun's silent departure, the dropped book, and above all the line that mentioned his own name as if rehearsed. That evening, as the last customers left the tea shop on East Street, 2 women lingered by the counter to consider what the nun's warning might mean. One declared the town unsafe, while the other opined that the inspector himself must be in dreadful danger. The girl behind the counter, whose ears were sharper than her discretion, carried both notions home and presented them to her father as fact. By nightfall, Flaxborough had reached a consensus. The nun's message signalled nothing less than a plot, and Inspector Pubright was at the centre of it. In his office, Pubright wrote a brief note for his own use. It contained only 2 words, "Why silent?" He underlined them once, laid down his pen, and allowed the question to rest. Inspector Pubright began, as he often did, not with the grand gesture of an investigation, but with the gentle plucking at threads. It was his view that people, when prodded bluntly, either tangled themselves into knots or became obstinately mute. When left to speak at their leisure, however, they revealed far more than they intended, by accident, by vanity, or simply by the need to be listened to. His first call was upon Mrs. Gedge, whose account of the chapel service had already reached more ears than any parish notice. She received him with the air of a woman quite prepared to have her recollections recorded in a dossier for the Home Secretary and perhaps published in the Times afterwards. "You may depend on me for accuracy, Inspector," she declared, ushering him into the front parlour that smelled of camphor and boiled turnip. "I always notice the little things, details, you know, that other people overlook. My late husband used to say that if I had gone in for detective work, there would be no unsolved crimes left in this county." Pubright nodded gravely and asked what she recalled of the nun's arrival. She came in just before the service began, without a sound, mind you. Most people make some sort of clatter with the pew door, but not she. Slid into her seat like a shadow, and never once did she join in the hymns, not even "Onward, Christian Soldiers." I watched very carefully. Did she seem to listen? To the sermon! "Oh, I should hardly call it listening," said Mrs. Gedge, with a sniff aimed more at the vicar than the nun. She sat perfectly still. Her head didn't move. To my mind, it was rehearsed. That sort of unnatural stillness, why, it gave me the shivers, and she carried a prayer book already in her hand, Inspector. That is unusual. Our books are kept at the back of the pews, as you know. For her to bring her own, well, I call that suspicious. Pubright expressed appreciation and, after a few further civilities, withdrew. Before her, reminiscences blossomed into theories about foreign conspiracies and buried treasure. Next, he tried the vicar. The poor man seemed to have aged visibly since Sunday. He confessed with an air of faint guilt that when he first saw the penciled note, he wondered whether it was some obscure biblical reference. Only after rereading it did he comprehend that it was an appeal to the police. "Do you know anyone who might write in this hand?" Pubright asked, showing him the message. The vicar adjusted his spectacles, then shook his head. "I do not, Inspector. But it has an air of desperation, don't you think? As if penned in haste by someone with great fear. And the mention of your name, how curious. What connection could such a person possibly have with you?" "That," Pubright said mildly, "is what I hope to discover." The third person he called upon was Mr. Carby, the gentleman with the booming voice who had sat near Mrs. Gedge. Mr. Carby received him with hearty cheer, offering tea of an unappealing grey colour and biscuits that had lost their spirit during the coronation. Yes, saw her, plain as day," Carby declared. "Tallish, I'd say, not one of your dainty nuns. Carried herself like a guardsman. And I'll tell you another thing, her shoes. No ordinary nun's sandals, no, sir. Proper stout shoes, good leather." "I'm something of a judge of leather, Inspector. Used to sell harness before the war. I'd put money on those being men's. Shoes, cut down and polished. Can't fool me with footwear." Pubright sipped his tea politely and asked whether the woman had spoken to anyone. "Not a syllable. Not to me, nor to the vicar, nor to any soul in that place. Silent as the grave. That's what struck me, Inspector. Silent nun in a chapel. What sort of religion is that, eh?" By the afternoon, Pubright had acquired a handful of impressions. The nun had entered with stealth, behaved with unnatural stillness, sung nothing, spoken nothing, and departed in haste. He also had 3 conflicting descriptions of her stature, her footwear, and her degree of piety. Back at the station, Sergeant Love awaited him with fresh gossip. "They say she was seen again last night, sir, by the canal. Old Tom Prowse swears. Blind, he watched her walk across the towpath without a lantern. And get this, she didn't make a sound, not even on the gravel." Pubright raised his brows slightly, but said nothing. He placed the prayer book on his desk and turned it so. The note faced him once more. "They are watching me. If anything should happen, tell Inspector Pubright." The wording, he reflected, was not that of a woman rehearsing theatrics. Nor was it the sort of jest concocted for village amusement. The silence, the sudden departure, the deliberate dropping of the book. It was a message staged as carefully as a coded telegram. The question remained, staged by whom and for what end? Pubright leaned back, his hands folded loosely in his lap, and gazed at the penciled scrawl. He did not smile, but his eyes softened with the faint gleam of a man who had seen many mysteries begin in this fashion, like ripples spreading outward, from the quietest of stones. By Tuesday evening, the town's appetite for certainty had grown restless. Gossip was all very well for filling teacups and pipe bowls, but the people of Flaxborough, being practical in their way, liked their mysteries tidied up within a week at most. Accordingly, attention began to settle, like dust on an unattended mantelpiece, upon a figure who could be made to fit the role of culprit with only the slightest persuasion. This was Mr. Lionel Hargreaves, a lodger at the Chapel House. He was, in himself, unremarkable. A mild man of 40, who claimed to make his living as a translator of foreign verse, though his neighbours seldom saw him translate anything more demanding than the racing news into losing wages. He had arrived in town some months earlier with a trunk, a violin case, and an air of melancholy that some interpreted as refinement and others as debt. The theory, as it circulated, was beguilingly simple. Mr. Hargreaves, possessing a certain lean and ascetic figure, had dressed as a nun to conceal himself in the chapel, for purposes unknown but certainly sinister. His lodgings being so near at hand lent convenience to the disguise, and his solitary habits provided all the necessary suspicion. At the Mason's Arms, this conclusion was embraced with enthusiasm. Mr. Brigg, the tobacconist, remarked that he had always mistrusted men who fiddled in either sense. Mrs. Gedge declared triumphantly that she had once seen Mr. Hargreaves purchase candles of an unusually thick variety, which could only have been intended for black masses. Sergeant Love, overhearing these verdicts on his rounds, felt himself equipped with sufficient cause to put the idea to his superior. "Seems to me, sir," he suggested that evening, "if you put a black habit on Hargreaves and set him in a pew, you'd not tell the difference. He's got the same long jaw, the same way of keeping quiet. The townsfolk are all but ready to swear it was him." Pubright considered this without comment. He had learned that the sergeant's "seems" to me was the herald of a theory formed in conversation with publicans rather than facts. Still, the lodger at the Chapel House was a reasonable beginning. The inspector visited Hargreaves the next morning. The man opened his door in a dressing gown of uncertain cleanliness, his violin under one arm. His face expressed the surprise of one who rarely received visitors before noon, or indeed at any time. "Mr. Hargreaves," Pubright began gently, "I hope I'm not intruding. I wondered if I might trouble you with a few questions about Sunday morning's service at St. Frideswide's." "I don't attend services," Hargreaves said, not rudely, but with the weary frankness of a man frequently asked why he failed. 2. "I prefer to spend Sundays in study or practice." He raised the violin a little, as though to vouch for his claim. "You live close by the chapel?" "Yes." "The organ reaches my window. More's the pity." He gave a small, bitter smile. It is difficult to translate Verlaine when accompanied by a wheezing hymn. Pubright allowed himself a mild observation on the inconvenience of sacred music. He asked whether Hargreaves had noticed any unusual visitors to the house or the lane in recent days. Visitors? The lodger frowned. Only the postman, though he comes less often than my creditors would like. Otherwise, no. The inspector thanked him and turned to go. As he did so, his eye caught the edge of a black garment thrown over a chair. It was a coat, shiny at the seams and frayed at the cuffs. Not quite a nun's habit, though perhaps a cousin to one if seen by candlelight. Pubright made no remark. He simply wished the man good morning and left, his step as unhurried as if he had been inquiring the time of day. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was quick to pronounce satisfaction. "That's it then, sir. He's the one. No mistake about it. The coat alone proves it. You can't tell me it's a coincidence." Pubright folded his hands upon the desk. "Coincidence," he said, mildly, "is an unfashionable word. Yet it is the most industrious of phenomena. It works overtime in every town of England." The sergeant looked blank, uncertain whether to agree or apologize. The inspector turned again to the prayer book lying before him. His eyes lingered upon the note, "They are watching me." The words did not seem suited to Mr. Hargreaves, whose chief oppression was surely unpaid rent. And there was another small matter, the shoes which Mr. Carby had so confidently described as stout leather. Pubright reflected that if suspicion were to rest on Hargreaves, it did so more for the comfort of the town's gossips than for any comfort of logic. Yet it was useful, he thought, to let the town enjoy its suspect for a little while. The true answer, he suspected, was still waiting in silence. On Wednesday morning, Inspector Pubright, with his usual preference for walking rather than riding, made his way along the cobbled high street toward the chapel. He was not yet convinced that Mr. Hargreaves, gloomy as he was, had troubled himself to impersonate a nun, nor was he persuaded that the matter could be so easily put to rest, though Sergeant Love was already rehearsing aloud the wording of a triumphant arrest report. The chapel stood quiet in its narrow lane, the kind of quiet that suggested not peace, but neglect. Its small iron gate sagged on its hinges, and the lichened steps leading to the door carried the faint scent of damp leaves. Pubright paused a moment before entering, his eyes taking in the modest garden plot beside the chapel house. There, among half-dead rose bushes and an abandoned wheelbarrow, something caught his attention. A handkerchief, white but muddied, lay tucked awkwardly beneath the wheel of the barrow. It was not the garden rubbish one usually found in such places. Picking it up with care, Pubright observed it was neatly hemmed and marked in tiny embroidered letters. C.L. The initials meant nothing to him for the moment, but the detail was stored, like a note in a ledger, for later balancing. Inside the chapel itself, the pews smelled faintly of furniture polish, and the prayer books, save for the one still in police custody, were stacked tidily in their wooden racks. He examined the second pew where the nun had sat. On the floor beneath, faintly visible against the stone, were two marks, parallel scratches as though made by shoes, shifting impatiently, or perhaps nervously. Kneeling, Pubright ran a finger along them. They were shallow, not old. He straightened slowly, a picture of polite contemplation, and stood for a while in the cool hush of the nave. It was then the verger entered, a small, fussy man named Mr. Hardstaff, whose duties consisted mainly of scolding children who ventured near the font. He seemed flustered to find the inspector there. "Oh, I beg your pardon, sir. Didn't expect anyone about, just locking up, you see. You're quite welcome, Mr. Hardstaff. May I trouble you with a question or two?" The verger wrung his cap between his hands. "Course, sir. Anything you wish." "On Sunday, did you notice the lady in religious dress who attended the service?" Mr. Hardstaff's eyes widened. "Notice her? I should say I did. Strangest sight since the day a stray dog wandered up to the altar. She didn't speak to me, though, not a word, just glided in and glided out." "Did she leave anything behind apart from the prayer book?" The verger hesitated, as though uncertain whether his memory might be of use. Then, "Come to think of it, she did drop a glove. Not here in the chapel, mind. Outside, near the lane. I picked it up, but when I went to look for her, she was gone. I kept it, thinking perhaps she might return." From his pocket he produced a small black glove, creased from handling. It was not of the ordinary sort worn by ladies at Sunday service. The stitching was finer, the fingers narrower, and one of the seams had been clumsily mended. "May I keep this for the moment?" Pubright asked. "Oh, certainly, Inspector. I've no use for such things." Pubright thanked him and walked slowly back to the station, his steps unhurried but his mind quietly engaged. The handkerchief with its initials, the scuffed marks under the pew, the glove with its patched seam, each was trifling in itself, yet trifles had a way of surviving, where greater clues were tidied away. At his desk he laid the glove beside the prayer book and considered them together. A woman, apparently anonymous, yet leaving behind a prayer book with a direct message, a glove of peculiar make, and perhaps, if the handkerchief belonged to her, initials to be traced. Sergeant Love entered, looking pleased with himself. "News, sir. I've asked around. Hargreaves is known to pawn things now and then, mostly books. Fellow at the pawnbroker's swears he saw him try to sell a pair of women's gloves last winter. That fits the bill, doesn't it?" Purbright's gaze rested on the patched seam of the glove before him. "It might fit, Sergeant," he said softly. "But gloves, like stories, can belong to more than one person. We shall not hurry." But him looked baffled, but nodded. He had long since learned that the inspector's reluctance to hurry was less a weakness than a kind of armour against being made a fool of. That evening, Pubright walked home through the town, observing, as he always did, the small, unconsidered patterns of human life, Mrs. Cribble taking in her washing, though it was hardly dry, Mr. Brigg pulling down his shop blinds with unnecessary flourish, the cluster of boys kicking a ball dangerously near the chemist's window. The town went on in its habitual round, while somewhere within it lay the answer to why a woman had, dressed as a nun, written his name in haste, and vanished. And as he walked, he felt certain the answer would not be found in the easy suspicions of the crowd, but in the overlooked seam, the forgotten scrap, the trivial detail that persisted when memory failed. If Flaxborough had any consistent trait, it was its ability to produce, on short notice, an abundance of witnesses who had seen, heard, or intuited exactly what no one else had. By Thursday, 6 new characters had emerged from the folds of local life, each carrying some fragment, real or embroidered, of the nun's mystery. The first to present herself at the police station was Miss Lucy Bream, a schoolteacher, of upright bearing whose spectacles gave her pronouncements the authority of Scripture. She announced with scarcely a greeting that she had observed the nun on Saturday evening before the service, standing at the bookseller's window on Market Street. She was studying the second-hand shelf most intently, Miss Bream said, her eyes gleaming behind the lenses. "And I noticed, Inspector, that she was mouthing words as she read, but silently, like a pupil reciting in class. Now, what do you make of that?" Pubright thanked her gravely and made a note. He did not mention that the bookseller's window displayed at present only railway timetables and a single copy of the Pilgrim's Progress, which had languished there for a year. No sooner had Miss Bream departed than the door opened again to admit Mr. and Mrs. Hopley, proprietors of a modest drapery. Mr. Hopley spoke little, but his wife compensated with eagerness. We saw her ourselves.
"Inspector, on Monday morning," Mrs. Hopley declared.
At least I did. She came into our shop as bold as brass, looked over the counter at the silks, never said a word, mind, and then turned on her heel and left, without buying a thing. Quite rude, but I recognized her all the same. That wimple—
"You see, hard to mistake." Her husband coughed discreetly. "Could have been anyone in black, Maud?" "Nonsense, Henry. It was her, and I'll stand by it." "A nun looking at silks. Now what sort of nun does that?"
The next day brought forward a further volunteer, old Mrs. Prowse, whose son worked the canal barges. She claimed to have seen the nun walking along the towpath at dusk, her black figure distinct against the water. Didn't hear her come. Didn't hear her go, the old lady muttered. But she was there, mark my words, watching the barges like she was waiting for someone. To this growing catalogue of testimonies was added one more, less dramatic, but more intriguing. A letter arrived at the station, unsigned, written in a cramped but deliberate hand. "Inspector Pubright, the nun is no nun. She lodges at the east side of town under another name. Look for her where the curtains are always drawn. Do not trust appearances." The sergeant regarded the letter with open excitement. "That proves it, sir. She's hiding out in disguise. Curtains always drawn. That'll be one of those houses along Netherby Row. Shall we knock them all up, one by one?" Purbright's expression suggested mild appreciation for the sergeant's energy, tempered by his preference for discretion over siege warfare. "If someone wished us to search Netherby Row," he murmured, "it might be because something lies elsewhere. Letters, Sergeant, have the curious habit of pointing us in the wrong direction." Meanwhile, the townsfolk continued to embroider. Some said the nun was the secret wife of a bankrupt alderman. Others whispered she was a runaway from a foreign convent, pursued by agents of Rome. Children made a game of it, playing silent nun in the square by wrapping themselves in bedspreads and stalking one another. The entire town seemed engaged in a theatre for which no script existed. But amidst the chatter, Purbright's attention lingered on smaller things. He thought again of the handkerchief marked CL. Who was CL? Not a resident in the parish register, nor among the chapel's tiny congregation. He thought of the glove with its clumsy seam. Such mending spoke not of poverty alone, but of someone without skill in needlework. A woman accustomed to sewing would never have left such an awkward repair. On Friday, he took a slow walk through Netherby Row, not knocking on doors, but observing. A narrow street of houses whose lace curtains were indeed habitually drawn, it yielded little save for the sight of one particular window where the curtain twitched as he passed. He noted the address but did not pause. Better, he felt, to let whoever was watching believe they were unseen. Back at the station, Sergeant Love waited with more gossip. "Sir, it's spreading round that the nun was seen in the company of Mr. Hargreaves himself down by the Market Cross late last night. 2 separate witnesses swear to it." Purbright allowed the faintest smile to crease his features. 2 witnesses, Sergeant, are rarely twice as reliable as one. More often, they are half as much. The sergeant looked perplexed, but Purbright offered no explanation. He only turned the unsigned letter over in his hand, thoughtful, for all the swelling crowd of suspects and the thickening fog of accounts. The matter to him still circled round 3 trifles: a glove, a handkerchief, and a pencilled cry for help. Somewhere among them lay a thread that would lead not only to the nun's identity, but to the person who wanted her silenced. On the following Tuesday, when the air in Flaxborough had acquired that damp, vegetable scent which comes before rain, something happened which caused the mutterings about Canterbury's chapel to move, beyond idle conjecture and into the sharper realm of unease. It was Mrs. Broom, Flaxborough's most enduringly militant church flower arranger, who made the discovery. She had gone, as she frequently did, to the vestry of St. Saviour's to collect some candle stubs, her notion being that thrift in wax would help maintain a moral example for the congregation. On arriving at the vestry cupboard, she found not only the expected clutter of brass polish, hymn numbers, and embroidered kneelers, but also a long dark veil folded very neatly upon the top shelf. It was, unmistakably, a nun's veil. Mrs. Broom was not a woman to understate matters. Within the hour she had managed, by repeated telephone calls to acquaintances, to inform half the parish that an ecclesiastical article of foreign persuasion had been found lurking in the bosom of Anglican property. The discovery filtered through. The various timbers of domestic receivers had by tea-time grown into a story that a nun herself had been caught attempting to stow away in the vestry. By nightfall, in the pub snug, the tale included her having uttered a vow of silence so binding that she had refused even to order a pint. Inspector Pubright received the news the following morning from Sergeant Love, who, as usual, looked faintly apologetic for having to present facts that so obstinately resisted neatness. "A veil, sir," Love said, consulting a small notebook, described as black, about 2 feet in length, with fastening pins intact. No sign of wear apart from a faint perfume. Perfume? Pubright lifted his eyebrows. That is rather enterprising for a cloistered life. Love allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Mrs. Broom insists upon it. She sniffed thoroughly, something she associates with Christmas hampers. Pubright asked that the item be brought to the station. When it arrived, carefully folded inside a biscuit tin, he examined it at length. The material was of good quality, and the perfume, though faint, was more reminiscent of cheap soap than monastic austerity. "Most peculiar," Pubright murmured, returning the veil to its tin. "We must ask ourselves whether this object was left in innocence or in mockery." The word mockery was seized upon by gossip as a spark is by dry tinder. By midday there were firm reports of sacrilege. Some insisted that the veil must have been left as a prank by mischievous youths. Others hinted, with a furtive narrowing of eyes, that an actual nun, or someone disguised as such, was using Flaxborough's chapels for reasons best not scrutinized after dark. At the Bull Hotel, where council officers habitually lunched, Councillor Crispin put forward his view. "Obvious, isn't it? The veil was planted. Some agitator from the nonconformists, no doubt, trying to discredit our established traditions." His fork, poised over a shepherd's pie, trembled with indignation. Miss Teatley, who taught domestic science and was reputed to be privy to more than was good for anyone, leaned forward confidentially. "I heard that the veil smelt of lavender." "Polish! That means it belonged to Mrs. Wintle, who always wears lavender. And she, used to run the Catholic orphanage before it closed." The theory had no sooner left her lips than it was travelling, with small mutations, to every shop counter in the High Street. That evening, Pubright decided to pay another call to Canterbury's chapel. He took Love with him, more as company than assistance, for the sergeant's solid silence was a valuable counterweight to the twittering voices of others. The chapel was empty, its pews coated in dust that bore the faint tracks of mice. The air was stale, carrying the faintest undertone of mildew. At the altar rail, Pubright paused, studying the faint scuffs upon the wooden floor. "Recent shoes," he observed quietly. "Not the workman's heavy boots, something lighter." Love bent down. "2 sets, sir." Indeed. Pubright straightened, his expression mild. A meeting, then, in a place most would deem deserted, and the veil afterwards deposited somewhere else. Whether to mislead or to challenge, I cannot yet say. They walked back slowly, their footsteps echoing in the nave. Outside, the lamplighter was at his evening rounds, and the first drops of rain pattered onto the paving stones. By the next day, the second incident, the veil, had embedded itself so firmly into public discussion that the original sighting of the silent nun was retold with heightened colour. No longer was she merely a pale figure glimpsed in passing. She had acquired, in some accounts, a halo of candlelight, and in others, the suspicious ability to vanish into walls. What impressed Pubright more, however, was not the embroidery of legend, but the nervousness creeping into certain respectable faces. Mr. Copley of the bank, ordinarily affable, had turned uncharacteristically brusque when the veil was mentioned in his hearing. Mrs. Wintle herself, when visited by Love, denied having any knowledge of it, but fussed so continually with her teacup that a spot of milk landed upon her sleeve. And most telling of all was the rector, the Reverend Chubb. When Pubright asked him, in a voice deliberately neutral, whether he had any knowledge of persons using the chapel after hours, the man's face grew curiously pink. He denied it, of course, but his denial was hasty, far swifter than Pubright would have expected of a gentleman accustomed to pondering sermons. As Pubright walked back across the marketplace afterwards, he carried with him not certainty, but the calm awareness that matters were deepening. The veil was no prank. Of that much he felt assured. It was, rather, a sign, not perhaps of sanctity, but of secrecy. And in Flaxborough, secrecy was almost always a currency with which reputations were bought, sold, or destroyed. He smiled faintly to himself. The town, so outwardly somnolent, was stirring beneath its surface, and Pubright, with his customary patience, was content to wait for the next ripple to break the calm. Inspector Pubright sat alone in his office that evening, the blinds half-drawn, the desk lamp cutting a modest pool of light against the growing dusk. The day's interviews lay in neat stacks of notes before him, not because he required such order, but because he found it lent him patience. A detective in Flaxborough did not hurry toward conclusions. The town itself disapproved of haste in most things, crime included. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded in a posture that suggested prayer, but was in fact closer to careful neutrality. On his blotter, the curious puzzle of the nun's silence had begun to gather its proper outlines. Silence itself, Pubright mused, was a commodity in Flaxborough. Some people hoarded it for dignity, others for spite. To remain wordless at a civic ceremony was, in its way, louder than any outburst. He thought of Mrs. Bradlaugh's flustered insistence that the entire town had been scandalized, of Councillor Hatchley's veiled irritation about ecclesiastical impropriety, and of poor Miss Umber, who had defended the woman with a tremulous loyalty that bordered on awe. Was it genuine reverence, or fear of losing her own small pedestal in the community? Pubright considered that Miss Umber's tone, when she spoke of the silent nun, had been one of someone recalling a strict governess rather than a dear friend. Then there was Mr. Cartwright, whose impatience suggested that the silence had embarrassed him personally, as though the nun's muteness reflected upon his abilities as master of ceremonies. Embarrassment was often a stronger motive than anger, Pubright reminded himself. People could endure quite astonishing insults, but balk at being made to look ridiculous. And overshadowing all these smaller motives was the odd absence of tangible crime. What had occurred? Not theft, nor violence, nor any provable fraud, only a refusal to speak, which had caused a ripple of consternation greater than a broken window or a missing till. That, Pubright reflected, was the very thing that marked it as potentially serious. When townsfolk felt their dignity threatened, the consequences could easily outrun the original provocation. A further scrap of thought returned to him. Mrs. Glossop's remark about overhearing a fragment in the chapel vestry, a phrase that made little sense unless the nun had, at some time, spoken with surprising freedom. If true, then the woman's silence on the day of the ceremony was not an ingrained infirmity, but a choice. People always meant something by a choice. Pubright allowed himself a small sigh and pushed back his chair. Outside the window, the gassy
lamps were flaring into life, each a polite protest against the encroaching darkness. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked at nothing, then grew tired of its own insistence.
The inspector closed his notebook and reached for his coat. Tomorrow he would test a small question, delivered with all the gentleness he could muster, that might disturb the guilty into betraying themselves. In Flaxborough, after all, crimes were seldom buried deep. They lay just beneath the polished surface of routine, waiting for one careful prod to bring them to light. The following morning, Pubright resolved to approach the problem indirectly, as was his custom. He did not summon Mr. Hargreaves, nor did he attempt to accost any of the townsfolk. Instead, he crafted a scenario modest in appearance but deliberate in its implications. He sent a note to the vicar of Canterbury's chapel, inviting him to the station under the guise of discussing the parish accounts. At the same time, he asked Sergeant Love to ensure Mr. Hargreaves had cause to be in the area at a similar hour, ostensibly to deliver a report to the bookseller, Mr. Pender. This convergence, he hoped, might provoke the reaction he sought without any overt confrontation. By mid-morning, the inspector and the vicar were seated in the cool calm of the station office. Pubright had spread a few innocuous papers across the desk, receipts, parish notices, the chapel schedule, but the prayer book lay conspicuously to one side, untouched and open. Curious, Pubright began casually, that a book should appear in one place and then disappear. Items are often left behind in haste, I've noticed. Gloves, handkerchiefs, indeed, even garments. The vicar, polishing his spectacles, looked puzzled. Yes, I suppose so, Inspector. But are you implying— I imply nothing, Pubright said with the faintest elevation of his brows. I merely observe that some objects seem to attract attention beyond their material value. Take this prayer book, for instance. It contained a note addressed to me.
Odd, is it not, that a stranger should involve themselves in matters so far from their own concern? At that moment, the station door opened quietly. Hargreaves entered, violin case in hand, and paused upon seeing Pubright. The inspector, without it,
rising, allowed the sergeant to close the door gently behind him. Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves, Pubright said. I hope your journey to Pender's was uneventful. Hargreaves inclined his head, a polite but tense gesture. Quite, he said. Though I confess, Inspector, I find these detours rather unusual. Pubright inclined himself in return, leaning slightly forward. The unusual is not always unimportant. Consider, if you will, the veil found in St. Saviour's vestry and the glove discovered at Canterbury's chapel. Would it surprise you that such items, trifling in themselves, might nonetheless indicate something of consequence? Hargreaves' face betrayed the faintest tightening of the jaw. He glanced at the prayer book on the desk, then at the inspector, and for a brief moment his composure faltered. Are you suggesting, he asked with careful neutrality, that I had anything to do with this? Pubright allowed a polite pause. I suggest nothing beyond observation. People often reveal more in denial than they do in confession. Sometimes a question posed with precision elicits a truth that could not otherwise be heard. The lodger's eyes flickered toward the glove. Well, I cannot say I understand," he murmured. "That is understandable," Pubright replied. "It is not often easy to see where a small object may lead, or why a note addressed in haste might unsettle
an otherwise orderly mind."
For the space of a heartbeat, Hargreaves hesitated, then turned abruptly. "I must be going, Inspector. Business awaits." "Of course," Pubright said. "Do not hurry unnecessarily, and remember, appearances are often less deceptive than one supposes, yet still deserving of careful scrutiny." After Hargreaves left, Pubright allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. He had planted the observation, delivered the gentle pressure, and watched the fissures form in an otherwise calm surface. Sergeant Love looked uncertain. "Do you think he'll speak now, sir?" Pubright closed the prayer book, his fingers resting on the penciled note. "Whether he speaks or not, Sergeant, we have begun to see the shape of truth. People who believe themselves unnoticed often reveal themselves simply by walking past the line we draw. Outside the window, Flaxborough carried on in its usual rhythm. Shopkeepers were arranging their wares, children played near the fountain, and a soft wind rustled the lace curtains of Netherby Row. The town, as always, provided its clues in whispers and gestures rather than in overt cries, and Pubright, with infinite patience, noted each one. By Friday afternoon, Flaxborough was bathed in a gentle drizzle, and the town's familiar murmur carried through the narrow streets like a softened
hymn.
Inside the station, Inspector Pubright prepared for the moment he had long anticipated, the quiet, deliberate unmasking of the mystery that had unsettled the town for nearly a week. He invited the Reverend Chubb, Mr. Hargreaves, and Miss Umber to the station under various pretences. The trio arrived within the hour, each curious, each carrying their own unspoken theories. The vicar seemed uneasy, his habitual calm slightly ruffled. Hargreaves retained a studied neutrality, and Miss Umber, with her sharp eyes softened by loyalty, appeared to suspect that her own observations might be of use. Pubright began with a calm recital of the events as they had unfolded, speaking in his usual measured tone. The initial sighting of the silent nun, the discovery of the prayer book with the cryptic note, the glove, the handkerchief embroidered CL, and finally the veil found in St. Saviour's vestry. He allowed each item its due pause, encouraging the natural tension of the listeners' minds to focus on the trifles that had caused so much speculation. "I am aware," Pubright said, looking first at Hargreaves, "that our town has been quick to assign blame where it is easiest to do so. Mr. Hargreaves, you have been subjected to an abundance of suspicion, yet none of the items we have discussed bears direct evidence against you. Your routine, though quiet, is unremarkable, and your presence in the area coincidental. We may dismiss that notion entirely." Hargreaves inclined his head, relief mingled with a trace of irritation, as though his discomfort had been long in gestation. "The true explanation," Pubright continued, "lies instead in the conjunction of three small objects, all seemingly trivial but each bearing its own message. The glove, clumsily mended, belongs to Miss Umber. The handkerchief embroidered with CL was left by the same person, and the veil discovered in St. Saviour's vestry, well, that is the result of a deliberate, if cautious, plan to draw attention." Miss Umber gasped softly, her hand rising to her chest. I do not understand, Inspector." "Understandable," Pubright said with gentle assurance. "You see, the woman whom we all assume to be a nun, silent, mysterious, and ethereal, was neither a cloistered sister nor a visitor in disguise. She is, in fact, a former pupil of yours, Miss Umber, come to Flaxborough to deliver a message she could not speak aloud in public. The note was hers, the handkerchief a token left by her own hand, the glove, though left carelessly, is recognizable to you as it belonged to you once. The vicar leaned forward, puzzled. But why all the theatrics the town has been in? Turmoil for days. Pubright allowed a faint smile. Because, Reverend, sometimes a message must be delivered in silence, otherwise it is ignored. The lady wished to remain unnoticed, and yet, through careful placement of small objects, she ensured her plea was acknowledged. It was, in short, an exercise in discretion, not deception, a crime in intent she did not commit, only a puzzle she orchestrated to be solved. Hargreaves, finally, smiled faintly. So the mystery was no threat at all, merely a dramatization? Precisely, Pubright said. Human nature in Flaxborough favours drama over simplicity.
A silent nun appears and the town imagines conspiracies. A glove, a veil, a handkerchief, they become clues rather than tokens. And the simplest solution, attention through mild theatricality, is transformed into legend. Miss Umber, recovering from her initial shock, offered a hesitant laugh.
So all this fuss over me, and it was merely a matter of leaving a message discreetly? Exactly, Pubright replied. Sometimes the most remarkable disturbances arise not from wrongdoing, but from the extraordinary ways in which ordinary people seek to communicate, and in truth, that is a small mercy, for if we waited for genuine transgression, Flaxborough might indeed be a duller, quieter place than it has allowed itself to be. The vicar, though relieved, shook his head, muttering something about a town always finding scandal where none exists. Hargreaves offered a small nod, and Miss Umber, recovering her composure, seemed content that the truth had at last been brought gently to light. Pubright leaned back, hands folded, allowing the quiet satisfaction of resolution to fill the room. It was, in its understated way, exactly as it should be. All questions answered, no reputations ruined, and the curious balance of small town. Mystery restored to equilibrium. Outside, the drizzle had ceased. Flaxborough resumed its soft, familiar rhythm, the murmur of conversation, the clink of shop bells, the faint rustle of lace curtains in the evening breeze. Everything undisturbed, as though the town itself had been in on the secret all along, waiting only for the proper moment to release its tension. By Saturday morning, Flaxborough had resumed its accustomed rhythm, as though the week's small anxieties had been nothing more than a passing cloud. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with habitual precision, the postman delivered letters with unhurried familiarity, and the children at the fountain resumed their games, untroubled by ghosts of silent nuns or misplaced veils. Inspector Pubright sat at his desk in the quiet of the station, reviewing the notes he had collected over the course of the week. The case was, for all practical purposes, closed. No arrests had been necessary, no reputations permanently marred, and the town had returned to its everyday concerns, the price of coal, the church fete, and whether the new tea blend at the Mason's Arms was preferable to last month's. Reverend Chubb had visited the station to express his relief and gratitude. He was particularly careful to avoid any comment that might suggest culpability, although Pubright had noticed the faint pink tinge that betrayed residual discomfort at the week's events. Miss Umber had come in briefly to retrieve her glove and the handkerchief, her composure restored and her curiosity satisfied. Hargreaves, for his part, had returned to the quiet dignity of his lodgings, carrying his violin as if no distraction had ever intruded upon his life. Pubright allowed himself a small smile as he considered the town outside the window. Flaxborough had a way of absorbing scandal and transforming it into anecdote, of converting anxiety into humour, and of weaving even a minor mystery into the texture of its daily life without disturbance to its surface calm. The silent nun, the glove, the veil, all of it would be recounted, retold and embroidered in the weeks to come, yet without consequence, without harm. Sergeant Love entered, a cup of tea in hand, and paused politely. "Shall we mark the case closed, sir?" "Yes," Pubright said, taking the tea. "Closed, but remembered. Some matters are best preserved as stories, Sergeant, rather than investigations. Flaxborough will find its own amusements in the telling. And, in the meantime, we return to ordinary work." The sergeant nodded, settling into his chair with the quiet satisfaction of one who had observed, assisted, and learned from the patient methods of his superior. Outside, the town carried on, the baker arranging his bread, Mrs. Cribble airing her laundry, the distant toll of the church clock marking the gentle passage of hours. Life in Flaxborough, as always, was quietly eventful. Pubright returned to his paperwork, pencil in hand, noting small discrepancies, drafting polite letters, and recording the minor triumphs of the week. The mystery had resolved itself not through confrontation, but through observation, patience, and a careful weighing of trifles, and in this he found satisfaction. For Flaxborough, the silent nun had left behind only stories, whispered curiosities, and the soft, enduring reminder that the town, while outwardly tranquil, was always alive with the faint stirrings of hidden intrigue.